they claim that in the mid-1930s, the fascist state in Italy took over 80% of the economy and nationalized 80% of the economy and controlled 80%. They said, it's the same thing as China. The IRI, which is what it was called. They created something called the IRI, I don't know how to say it in Italian. But this institute, it basically, it had controlling shares in a bunch of different firms, right? So it's the same thing in China. How the state has controlling firms everywhere, and they control the economy. It's about the control. It's about the iron fist of the fascist authority. They're controlling the capitalists, and the capitalists in Italy are under control by the state. Okay. So this is the lie that they say, that 80% of the economy was owned by the state in Italy, that the IRI was an instrument of genuine nationalization. And I'm here to debunk that myth so you can respond to this lie properly and, know what you're talking about. So let's talk about Italy. So first of all, by the early 30s, the whole world was witnessing a banking crisis and a general crisis of capitalism. So across the world, companies were underperforming. There was a crisis in the rate of profit. I don't have to get into it. Yada, yada, yada. There was a banking crisis, all sorts of problems going on in the world, right? And this hit Italy very hard. Italy was already not a very rich country, a very developed country compared to others. So in the early 30s, there was a banking crisis in Italy because the major Italian banks, and actually before I want to get into anything, I want to talk about the Italian banks. So the major Italian banks, I think I have two off the top of my head. One of them, and I'm not going to remember the names, so you're going to have to forgive me. One of them was outright an organ of international finance. It was created by the Germans. And all this money, it ultimately comes from the British and the Dutch or whatever. But the Germans, the Austrians, and the Swiss, they created a bank in Italy and created on the German model. I think this was in the early 1900s. So that was one of the major Italian banks, just a direct tether and proxy for the interests of the global international capitalist class. Another bank was created by these weird, Genovese ancient vampire nobles and landowners and merchants and all these creepy, weird fucks, these Italian inbred aristocrats, these creepy vampires. Hero, what's up with the 100? Suez, what's up? So this is the origin of the major Italian banks. Fully private banks. They represent the international capitalist class, and they also represented, in a way, I would argue, domestic feudal interests that existed within Italy, that were very old, that dated for very back in the day. The weird, they wear those masks, like Eyes Wide Shut, and they're molesting children, and this is what they do. Anyway, let me continue. They're doing all these rituals and shit. Bunch of weird, creepy fucks, honestly. Fucking vampire, disgusting abominations on the face of the earth. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. So that they were hit with a crisis in the early 30s because these banks had issued a ton of loans. This was the German model. They were trying to prop up, though there's a dual model from the German universal bank model. I'm going to explain it to you, okay? And I want you guys to bear with me here. So what they would do is that in order to acquire the collateral assets with which to expand the issuing of loans, they would actually become shareholders in these various newly propped up and created industrial firms. So these industrial firms and companies would be created that are expected to yield revenues and grow in size. The banks would have a controlling interest through shares directly, but those shares would then be used as collateral in order to lend out more loans, right? And the companies in question, these banks are like parasites. The companies are servicing interest to them because they're in debt to these companies, and the debt will never be paid off because this is how the companies acquire, and combination of shares and loans that they can collateralize and then thereby, expand their loan mongering, usurious bankster interest. So they don't call it usury, they call it interest, but it's the same thing. Okay. Majority shares, I would say the original starting capital that made the industries and companies possible in the first place. Okay. So the Italian capitalism had a very peculiar, strange character from the outset, okay? So in the 30s, when we're talking about industries in Italy, when we're talking about, the means of production, so to speak, the banks own that shit. We're not talking about like private captains of industry and bold, audacious captains of industry. All of them were slaves of the banks, okay? And you need to understand that context to understand the nature of the fascist nationalizations. Wink, wink, nationalizations, okay? So, there was a banking crisis, and because these companies that, a lot of them were originally created through the loans that these banks issued, they were underperforming, just like the rest of the world. So they were not doing well. These industrial firms were being hit with the global crisis that everyone else was, and they were increasingly insolvent, and they became bad. Their liabilities, the bank's liabilities with respect to them, was endangering the banking system within Italy, was endangering the big banks and the banksters, and thereby, endangering their fucking foreign vampire paymasters or whatever, right? The international financial networks of capitalism. So these banks that have assets, they have shares and they have loans, they're bad loans. This is a typical crisis of capitalism. It happens all the time. It happened in 2008. They have these shit bad loans. They need to fucking get rid of them because they're threatening to destroy the banks, okay? And so the banks, they had these horrible loans. They had these worthless shares and, these outstanding liabilities that were an immense burden on them. Immense burden, okay? So what did Mussolini, what did Mussolini do and the fascist state do within Italy? Did they suddenly, the corporatist vision of the syndicalism, did they suddenly have a change of heart and decide to now we will tell the capitalists what to do? No, I'm going to tell you the Ponzi scheme that happened in case one of these anime retards try to say that fascist Italy nationalized shit, which they didn't. What happened was one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in the history of Europe, which is saying something, right? This thing called the IRI, which is this new institution created by the state, right? And what it did is it relieved the banks of their outstanding liabilities with respect to their loans as well as their shares in these industrial firms. And the IRI took those from the banks. Well, it didn't take them from the banks. It took the burden from the banks that the ownership of those things entailed. Now, how did it acquire the loans and how did it acquire the shares? Okay, let me explain this Ponzi scheme to you. How did the IRI acquire the controlling shares in these various bankrupt and insolvent companies to steer them and restructure them and whatever it did? How did they do it? So if it's when they say nationalization, what comes to your head is Bolshevik style expropriation. They're just going to take it. That's not what they fucking did. So let's just start there. They didn't nationalize it. What they actually did is they issued bonds in order to acquire the loans and the shares from the banks, the controlling shares in the firms. They issued bonds in order to finance it. So they paid for it. The nationalization compensated the owners, the banks, okay? But here's the hilarious part. This is the important part, and I want you to who did they sell these bonds to? These state bonds. Who did they sell the state bonds to pay for it? To the banks. So the banks bought bonds from the state, and the state used what the banks gave them in order to literally relieve the banks of their liabilities and rescue them. So it was like it was like worse than an Obama bank bailout. What happened is the public sector assumed the liabilities. The capitalists fucked up, so the public sector not only had to pay for it, but in paying for it, had to indebt itself to these private banks. So the state became indebted through the issuing of bonds to the banks, and the entire purpose of this switcheroo, the state was going to use public finances to make these firms solvent again, to restructure them, to fix them, whatever. And instead of the banks getting serviced interest from these shitty, unreliable firms and companies, they had a more secure, collateral and effectively a controlling interest in the state. The state, was a more secure asset to own. Basically, the banks would own the state itself instead of the fucking companies. And you own the companies, how reliable are they in terms of servicing the debt? Well, clearly they weren't. But if the state takes over, quote unquote, and then services you that same fucking interest on the debt, but just in a new form, in the form of bonds, it's more reliable. You're using the power of politics and the power of the state to pay debt and pay interest to the bankers. And that is the essence of what fascism is. Fascism is basically when, instead of the market and the private sector, the banksters acquire their usurious interest-mongering debts, using the batons of the state. The state takes a big stick and it beats the shit out of the debtors, in this case, the Italian public, in order to pay the creditors. Usually in a normal capitalist economy, this has to happen in a purely economic way. But because of a crisis in capitalism, the banksters will weaponize the state and use public resources and assets in order to pay themselves, I guess, in order to exact their pound of flesh, proverbially, and so to speak. So this is actually what happened in Italy. The private sector took over the state effectively, fully and completely. The firms in question that the IRI took over were never independent to begin with. They were controlled and owned and created in the first place by the banks, but they became a financial liability because they were underperforming. And so that we're talking about a banking crisis. We're talking about these banks, not only they're no longer able to be paid anymore, the foundations upon which they rest are being shaken. So what Mussolini and the fascist state actually did was they rescued the banks. So anytime somebody says the IRI nationalized the Italian economy, just tell the truth. What the fascists did was rescue the banks by making the public assume their liabilities, which is exactly what happened. At no point was the economy expropriated. At no point did the state actually fucking own anything. Everything they owned was financed from bonds that were issued on credit from the banks themselves. If the state owned it, the state wouldn't be in debt to the banks, but they were. This weird, by the way, creditor-debtor syzygy, it's like it was a prototype of the American super-imperialist system described by Hudson. But you see this in Italy, absolutely. Because here the state, the IRI, is both a creditor by assuming the bank's liabilities, but also a debtor. Because, in order to finance the acquisition of these shares in these firms and the acquisition of the bank's debts, it had to sell bonds, right? And the bonds are themselves servicing interest or servicing payments. So you see, this is why I wanted to talk about it. It's funny when they say, "Oh, the fascists were fighting the capitalists." The entire state was made a prostitute of the capitalist class. The public continued servicing the bankster vampires in a new form, assuming all the liabilities and the burdens. But where were the benefits? Well, there weren't any benefits. And although the scheme was a failure, it couldn't work. So how the balance sheet is not going to square when you think about it just in these terms. Okay, the state is going to issue bonds. What is going to guarantee the reliability of these state issued bonds? What's going to securitize the IRI in the Italian state? Because everything is going to shit, and well, it's war. Let's go invade Ethiopia. Let's go conquer and attack Croatia and the Balkan countries, whatever. Steal their resources and steal their land, and that way we can make the balance sheet even. Okay? We can somehow ensure that the whole thing doesn't spiral into an infinite void and vortex of insurmountable debt. And we just take resource. I mean, by the way, does that sound familiar? This is what the USA is basically de facto doing right now. Actually, not even de facto, de jure about to do right now with Venezuela. So, yeah, they socialized the losses. That's what happened in fascist Italy. They socialized the losses. That the state did not nationalize anything in the sense of expropriation. They didn't just take it over and say, this is ours now. They paid for it using loans, bonds given to them by private banks. They paid for it. They not only did they recompense the banks, they did it on and with interest, on interest. Yeah, the Italian military-industrial complex was also controlled by the banking cartels as well. So there was no state-owned enterprise in Italy. Nothing was nationalized. So let's compare that to China. Okay, how did China acquire? It's like so stupid I have to say this. Let's compare the IRI to Chinese institutions, the People's Bank, the People's National Bank, the various state-owned enterprises, the various assets and whatever. How did the CPC acquire the various means of production that it does own within China? Well, they originally had them in the first place because under the Mao era, it was owned as such. It was a traditional Soviet-style socialist economy. So the CPC in the state already was the controlling interest. There was no mediation by any banks. They built it in the first place, and they did not build it on credit. They didn't take out loans from banks in order to do so. They did so through sheer willpower, through the Mao era mass mobilizations. Now, admittedly, in the first 5-year plan of the People's Republic of China, China was taking on immense debts from the Soviet Union, okay? And the Great Leap Forward and the rest happened because China didn't want to be indebted to the Soviet Union anymore. So it had to just build everything up from scratch using sheer willpower. So the way the fascists like to posture, we're just going to do it with the pure will. The way they posture and this facade they put up, well, the Chinese actually did use sheer willpower to build up their economy. And that's why China has state ownership to this day. They didn't have to borrow from banks and recompense capitalists. No, they just fucking did it. They're the ones who built it. Circuit, what's going on, bro? Appreciate you. And you need to understand, in Italy, you don't even have to look at the industrialists and the capitalists, because those are not people at the highest point of the pecking order, it's the bankers. Okay, the bankers in Italy were in command and control of the whole thing. The whole history of Italy, the whole history of Germany, it's all about finding roundabout ways to service interest on debt. Germany was the same thing. Germany's, and you know what's funny about Italy? Let me continue. Even post 1935, with the sanctions by the League of Nations that was imposed on Italy, at no point did Italy legally declare the obligations that it owed Britain for World War I null and void. It never did so. The outstanding payments the private banks of Italy owed to the foreign banks, they may have been disrupted by war, but they were never legally nullified. They were still on paper and legally, and the fascist government could have nullified them and canceled the debts, and they didn't. They didn't because there was an expectation that if the fascist powers won the war, that the international capitalists, the financial capitalists, would be recompensed and would be, continuing to extract and suck the blood of the resources and capital and wealth of Italy and of the world, of Ethiopia by proxy in the world, Yeah, these cartels, as Rev is saying, I mean, this is another example of the Ponzi scheme of Italian fascism. Private companies and banks would threaten to go on strike. They would overcharge on their shitty equipment, their war equipment. And if the government didn't pay the prices that they wanted, they would threaten to go on strike. So this was the fucking circus of fascist Italy, where literal capitalists, just like in Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, they would literally threaten to go on strike. Has that ever happened in China? I think that guy Jack Ma, he said one thing semi-critical about China's government one time. Nobody ever heard of him again. But in Italy, where supposedly it's the same thing as China, or China's a fascist country, apparently. In Italy, the so powerful and emboldened were the private parasite class that they would threaten to go on strike if the state didn't pay for their ridiculously, overmarked, shitty assets. So when people say China is just like fascist Italy because, the IRI, Italy, the state owned, they're taking excerpts from these retarded books where they're like, that one excerpt where effectively, Italy had the second largest state-owned assets in the world next to the Soviet Union. They take that and read it, and there's there's all these assumptions that come with that they just, really? Based Mussolini just took it from the capital? No, he paid for it on credit to private banks who themselves wanted to get rid of it because it was a liability that was threatening to destroy them. The state didn't actually own it. How can the state own it if they were indebted, first of all, to these banks? Second of all, the state didn't even have, when they say, they controlled it. Controlled it for what purpose? To restructure them and make them solvent so that they could be given back to the banks. That's another thing. This wasn't even considered a permanent solution. The idea was that the state was going to take these liabilities, take on the burden, fix the mess the capitalists made in the first place, and give it back once they did that. So this is the reality instead of the fake false history that they're trying to feed you. The IRI was not an organ for genuine nationalization. Genuine nationalization means I'm taking this factory. This factory is mine. I own it, and that's it. That's not what the IRI did. The IRI paid for shares that control it, sometimes controlling shares, sure, that banks owned in some firms, that these shares were liabilities, by the way, and took the liabilities, the debts as well, and paid for them using, not only using public coffers and public treasuries, but by issuing bonds to the very same banks. And you want to know, and you want to know the worst part. This is the fascist playbook. You want to know how else the state paid for this? Or I should say the public paid for it? How did the public pay for this? This burden that the state took on behalf of the banks. How did the public pay for it? Well, in what literally is one for one the same thing as austerity that we see today, like in Javier Milei's, Argentina and elsewhere. The Italian fascist state privatized a bunch of previously publicly owned assets to pay for this shit. Literally, privatizations happened on a monumental scale in both Italy and Germany under Hitler. For this exact reason. So, yeah, and the people, that's another good point. Who actually owned the shares in the first place in the IRI? Were they just faceless public servants and bureaucrats? No, they were literally the former capitalist industrialists and landowners themselves, the agricultural landowners. So there you go. I mean, that was not nationalization. That was not the state is taking over. No, it didn't take over. It became a de jure, literal tool, direct weapon of the capitalist class to accomplish what it could not through the market. It became the prostitute. The IRA, it's like institutes. Let me look it up because I don't. It's something in Italian. I don't speak Italian. All right. See, yeah, I didn't know that. Giuseppe was one of them, one of the richest Italian commercial bankers. See, I didn't even know that. They go, well, China also has billionaires in China. Hey, let's look at the balance sheet. All this shit was created by the CPC. All of it. The whole economy. The whole economy was created by the communist state. And to whatever extent there is a private sector in China and whatever, that was created first by the state. Second, people were allowed to benefit as beneficiaries, of a regime-led system. In fascist Italy, you had a pre-existing capitalist class that made the state its bitch. So the order is completely reversed. In China, the CPC and the state owns, controls, and beats the shit out of the capitalists. Or let's call them the entrepreneurs, to be politically correct. But in Italy, the opposite was true. The capitalists and the they all banded together and made the state their prostitute, their bitch. And they raped the Italian public wholesale, looting public treasuries, indebting the Italian people unfairly and unduly, and privatizing public goods in order to pay for it. So it was a big Ponzi scheme. And by the way, doesn't this make sense? Do you really, even from what you know of the aesthetics of Italian fascism, just judging off of that, you really think the state just came in and took over? No, they didn't. It was a big, Mussolini was putting on a big show. Doesn't it make sense it was a Ponzi scheme the whole time? Because by the way, it was. It was just a big Ponzi scheme, okay? No, you think they wiped the debts and just said, whoa, we're never going to pay. That's what Lenin did. See, the difference between communism and fascism isn't that fascists were more realistic and oh no, we don't want to do these utopian experiments. It has nothing to do with social engineering or social experimentation. The difference between communism and fascism is that the communists straight up say, hey, bankers, fuck you. We're literally just not going to pay We're not paying you any debt. We're wiping it out. We're taking over. Like, fuck you. Like, literally, go kill yourself. And then the fascist way is like, we have to, of course, fascists are more realistic. They're not breaking with international finance. They're not canceling the debt. They're not, we believe in the sacred institution of private property. When fascists say that, you think they're talking about some Joe Schmo, like small farmer who's defending his ranch with his dogs? They're talking about private property. They're talking about assets and debts owned by banks. That's what they're talking about.